scope, Lieutenant. Are they registering?
Negative, Captain. The screen is blank, but they're still pacing us. The radar shows high-speed contacts surrounding the B-17s.
But they appear non-hostile?
We can't confirm that, sir. They just pace the planes.
At 35,000 feet above the sleeping Earth, where the sky turns into an endless black ocean and the ground below dissolves into nothing more than scattered constellations of human life, I found myself staring out of a commercial airplane window in the year 2013, somewhere between Los Angeles and the cold, wooded edges of May, en route to a military survival training course that would test the limits of the human body and mind. Yet nothing in that training would ever unsettle me. Quite like what unfolded mid-flight, because somewhere over the vast darkness of the American interior, perhaps above the Rockies, perhaps above an unnamed stretch of wilderness where no road dares to cut through, the lights below vanished entirely, leaving only a void so complete it felt unnatural, as if civilization itself had fallen away. And it was then that I noticed them. Two lights, distant yet distinct, glowing steadily beneath the aircraft, my mind instinctively grasping for the simplest explanation, convincing itself that they were merely headlights from a lone vehicle threading its way through a forest far below, their flicker caused by passing trees or uneven terrain. Yet the longer I watched, the more that explanation unraveled, because the lights persisted not for seconds but for long, dragging minutes. 15, then 20, then nearly 30. Far too long for any car to remain visible at such altitude, and far too bright to belong to a road that should not have existed beneath us at all, forcing my thoughts to pivot uneasily toward other possibilities. Reflections perhaps, some stray illumination from inside the aircraft bouncing impossibly against layers of glass and atmosphere. Though no matter how I shifted my position or strained my eyes, nothing inside the cabin aligned with what I was seeing, and the lights remained fixed yet subtly moving, indifferent to my growing confusion, until doubt pushed me to seek confirmation, a sanity check, and I turned to the master sergeant seated beside me, a man I had only just met, yet whose presence grounded me in the reality of shared experience, tapping his shoulder and asking him to look to tell me whether I was imagining things. And when he leaned across, peering into the darkness with narrowed eyes before quietly admitting that he saw them too, saw something he could not explain. An unease settled deep in my chest, because once a mystery is witnessed by more than one set of eyes, it stops being personal and starts becoming something far larger, something that resists easy dismissal. And though he soon turned away to speak with his wife, leaving the moment suspended and unresolved, the lights continued their silent vigil before eventually fading back into the blackness from which they had emerged, leaving behind only questions, unanswered and stubborn, questions my rational mind has wrestled with ever since. Because even now, I cannot say what those lights truly were, only what they were not. And it is that lingering uncertainty, that refusal of the universe to neatly explain itself, which draws my thoughts backward through time, toward other men and other aircraft, men who stared into dark wartime skies under far deadlier circumstances and reported similar impossible lights. Encounters that commanders, scientists, and historians would struggle to categorize, dismiss, or bury, because during the final, desperate months of the Second World War, Allied pilots flying over Europe and the Pacific began reporting glowing objects that paced their aircraft, maneuvered with impossible agility, vanished at will, and defied radar entirely. Objects first feared as secret enemy weapons and later remembered by a name that would echo through military folklore and paranormal history alike. A name born from nervous humor and disbelief, whispered in cockpits and written into reports that were never meant for public eyes. A name that still lingers in the fog between fact and speculation, between war and myth. Because before there were flying saucers, before Roswell, before the modern language of UFOs existed at all, there were the Foo Fighters of World War II, silent watchers in the night sky, appearing without warning, disappearing without trace, and leaving behind a question that has never truly been answered. When men wage war beneath the heavens, who or what might be watching from above? By the late months of 1944, as Nazi Germany buckled under pressure from every direction and the skies above Europe filled nightly with engines, tracers, and the dull thunder of distant explosions, the men of the Allied night fighter squadrons operated in a world few civilians could imagine, a realm where darkness erased depth, where the horizon vanished, and where survival depended on trust in instruments, instincts, and each other. And it was within this unforgiving void that the first truly unsettling Foo Fighter encounters took place, beginning not with panic or combat, but with confusion when a twin-engine night fighter lifted off from a cold airstrip in eastern France and climbed into a moonless sky, its crew tasked with patrolling the Rhine River corridor, hunting German aircraft, trains, and convoys under the cover of darkness, confident in their radar systems and well-versed in every trick the enemy might attempt, yet utterly unprepared for what they were about to witness. Because somewhere over the borderlands between France and Germany, where hills blurred into shadow and the earth below seemed to dissolve into pure blackness, a voice crackled through the intercom from the rear of the aircraft, reporting a line of bright lights off the left wing, 8 or 10 of them, glowing orange and evenly spaced, appearing at first glance like a convoy moving through the hills, a familiar sight on countless missions. Yet something about them felt wrong, and as the crew adjusted their heading and studied the phenomenon more closely, doubt crept in, because navigation charts showed no hills in that direction, no roads, no settlements, and the lights did not remain fixed to the ground as expected, instead lifting, sliding, and accelerating with a smoothness that suggested they were airborne. And when the radar operator scanned his scope, waiting for the telltale blips that would confirm enemy aircraft, he found only emptiness, the screen stubbornly clean, as if the sky itself were denying the existence of what their eyes clearly saw, prompting the crew to radio ground command for confirmation, only to receive the same baffling response that would become infamous among Foo Fighter witnesses. There was nothing else in the air, they were alone, and with tension tightening in the cockpit, the pilot made a decision shaped by training and instinct rather than fear, banking the aircraft hard toward the lights, lining up the guns, prepared to engage whatever experimental weapon or advanced fighter the enemy might have unleashed. Yet at the exact moment the aircraft closed the distance and the gun sight settled, the lights vanished, not fading or streaking away, but blinking out as if someone had thrown a switch, leaving the crew staring into empty darkness, hearts racing, only for the lights to reappear moments later far ahead, still moving rapidly, still glowing with that same unnatural intensity, as if mocking the very laws of pursuit. And for several minutes the crew followed, maintaining distance, watching the formation maneuver effortlessly through the sky before it vanished again, this time for good, leaving behind no debris, no radar trace, no explanation. And though the rest of the mission continued as planned, with targets destroyed and ammunition expended, the encounter clung to the men long after the engines cooled, discussed in hushed tones on the ground, weighed carefully against the risk of being labeled fatigued or unstable, because in wartime skies, seeing something you cannot explain can be almost as dangerous as enemy fire. Yet silence could not contain the phenomenon for long, because within days, other crews from the same squadron began returning with eerily similar stories. Single lights, pairs of lights, strings of glowing orbs that followed aircraft, paced them, peeled away at impossible angles, climbed vertically, dove without losing speed, and vanished whenever approached. Each report, strengthening the unsettling realization that these were not flares, not stars, not reflections, and not anything found in any intelligence briefing. And as the sightings multiplied, so did speculation, whispered theories bouncing between cockpits and briefing rooms, ranging from secret German weapons to bizarre atmospheric effects. Yet none fully satisfied the men who saw the lights firsthand, because whatever these objects were, they behaved with intention, as if observing, testing, or even playing with their human counterparts, never attacking, never firing, yet always present just long enough to unsettle and then disappear. And in a war defined by violence, loss, and brutal clarity, these silent encounters introduced something far more disturbing. Uncertainty, the creeping sense that the sky itself held secrets neither side truly controlled. As winter tightened its grip on Europe and the war ground on toward its violent conclusion, the strange lights that haunted the night skies refused to remain an isolated curiosity confined to a single crew or squadron, instead spreading like an unspoken contagion through Allied air units. Because once men began to talk, quietly at first, then with cautious openness, it became clear that the encounters were not rare, not imagined, and certainly not limited to one region or altitude. As pilots, flying at 1,000 feet, reported massive glowing objects drifting above them, while others at 10,000 feet described lights climbing vertically from the ground to meet their aircraft, matching speed, holding position, and then peeling away with deliberate control, maneuvers that defied everything aviators understood about aircraft performance. And although some initially tried to laugh it off, blaming fatigue, nerves, or bad mess hall food, the humor evaporated as sightings continued. Night after night, mission after mission, across different crews who had no contact with one another, all describing the same impossible details. Orange or red glowing spheres, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs or strings, capable of sudden acceleration, sharp turns, and flawless formation flight, yet completely invisible to radar, and even more unsettling, seemingly uninterested in attacking, content instead to follow, observe, and vanish, behavior that unnerved seasoned combat veterans far more than a conventional enemy ever could, because at least an enemy aircraft obeyed predictable rules. And as reports accumulated, the phenomenon spilled beyond night fighters into daylight operations, where pilots flying P-47s over Germany described metallic golden spheres drifting through the air like solidified sunlight, reflecting the low evening sun or perhaps emitting their own glow, while bomber crews spoke of huge silver objects floating near their formations, likening them to oversized Christmas ornaments hanging impossibly in the sky, their smooth surfaces catching the light as they moved with eerie calm. And when these daylight sightings began appearing alongside the night encounters, it became impossible for commanders and intelligence officers to dismiss the phenomenon as simple illusion. Yet no explanation fit cleanly, because flares did not maneuver, weather balloons did not pace aircraft. Jet fighters left exhaust trails and radar signatures, and no known German weapon behaved with such restraint or precision, creating a growing tension between official skepticism and frontline experience, a gap that widened with every new report, until eventually the men themselves did what soldiers have always done when faced with fear and uncertainty. They gave it a name, something to contain the unease, something half-joking yet oddly fitting. And within one particular night fighter squadron, inspired by a popular comic strip featuring a nonsensical firefighter character who often used the word foo as a meaningless stand-in for the absurd, the glowing objects became known as Foo Fighters, a name born not from science or intelligence briefings, but from the human need to label the unexplainable. And once spoken aloud, the name stuck, spreading quickly through squadrons and airfields, transforming whispered fear into shared folklore, because calling them Foo Fighters made them feel just slightly less threatening, even as their behavior continued to defy logic. And soon the term escaped the confines of military slang altogether, reaching journalists hungry for wartime mysteries and editors eager for strange headlines, until newspapers back home began reporting on floating mystery balls and secret Nazi weapons lurking in the skies over Europe, fueling public curiosity and speculation while doing little to comfort the men who actually encountered them. Because despite the headlines, no one on the ground could tell them what the Foo Fighters truly were. And worse still, no one could promise they posed no danger, leaving pilots to climb back into their aircraft night after night, knowing that beyond the known threats of flak, fighters, and mechanical failure, something else waited in the darkness, something silent and watchful. And though the Foo Fighters never fired a shot, never downed an aircraft in a dogfight, their psychological impact was profound, introducing an element of the unknown into a war already defined by chaos. And as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany and the skies grew ever more crowded, Foo Fighter sightings reached a strange peak, appearing so frequently that some crews began to accept them as an unofficial part of the mission environment, a background anomaly that might show itself at any moment, reminding them that even with all humanity's technological progress and destructive power, there were still forces or technologies that lay beyond their understanding. And as the war edged closer to its end, one question loomed larger with every unexplained encounter. If these objects were not illusions and not accidents of nature, then who had built them, and for what purpose? By December of 1944, the Foo Fighters were no longer just a cockpit secret traded between exhausted crews under dim briefing room lights, because the sheer volume of encounters had reached a breaking point where silence became impossible, and the war, already straining under rumors of wonder weapons and last-ditch German technology, now had a new enigma leaking into the public consciousness, as correspondents embedded with Allied forces began hearing the same strange stories from pilots who otherwise agreed on nothing except their exhaustion. And when these journalists pressed intelligence officers for clarification, they found none, only cautious deflections and vague acknowledgments that unidentified aerial phenomena had indeed been reported, language deliberately sterile, meant to calm rather than explain, yet the truth slipped out anyway, because in the final days of 1944, American newspapers ran articles describing mysterious glowing balls pacing Allied aircraft over Europe, quoting unnamed pilots who openly admitted that they had no idea what they were seeing. And when the New York Times published its now famous piece referencing these unexplained aerial objects, the Foo Fighters crossed an invisible line, transforming from military oddity into a public mystery. And with that transition came pressure, because once the public knows something exists, someone must be seen attempting to explain it. And so Army Air Force's intelligence units, already overwhelmed by the logistics of a global war, were tasked with evaluating reports that stubbornly refused to fit into any known category, prompting scientists, engineers, and meteorologists to review gun camera footage, pilot statements, and radar logs, searching for patterns that might anchor the phenomenon to familiar science. And the first explanations offered were cautious and conservative, pointing to atmospheric electricity, St. Elmo's fire, ball lightning, temperature inversions, or optical illusions caused by stress and fatigue. Yet each theory collapsed under scrutiny, because the Foo Fighters maneuvered with purpose, maintained formation, and demonstrated controlled acceleration that weather phenomena simply could not replicate, while the illusion hypothesis insulted pilots whose survival depended on sharp perception and whose reports aligned with unsettling consistency, leaving officials trapped between disbelief and admission, unable to publicly acknowledge ignorance while privately conceding that no satisfactory answer existed. And adding to the unease was the discovery that Allied aircraft were not alone in encountering the phenomenon, because intelligence intercepts and post-war interrogations would later reveal that German pilots had seen the same lights and suspected them to be secret Allied weapons, mirroring Allied fears that they were Nazi creations. A symmetry of confusion that suggested something far stranger than espionage or advanced engineering, because if both sides believed the objects belonged to the enemy, then the enemy could not be responsible. And as the war dragged toward its bloody conclusion, the Foo Fighters persisted, appearing over Europe and the Pacific alike, reported by American, British, German, and Japanese airmen who shared no common language or propaganda, only the same stunned descriptions, reinforcing the growing realization that the phenomenon transcended national borders and wartime alliances, and though no official report ever labeled the Foo Fighters as hostile, their presence unsettled planners deeply, because warfare depends on predictability, on understanding the tools and intentions of all participants. And these objects refused to declare themselves, refusing combat, refusing communication, refusing explanation. And when victory finally arrived in 1945 and the guns fell silent, the Foo Fighters did not receive a tidy resolution alongside surrender documents and victory parades, instead fading quietly from headlines as the world rushed to rebuild, their files boxed, classified, or quietly forgotten amid the far more pressing realities of post-war politics and nuclear weapons. Yet the mystery never truly disappeared, because the men who had seen the lights carried those memories home, told their stories to families and friends, and watched with a sense of uneasy recognition as reports of strange objects in the sky continued in peacetime, growing more frequent rather than less. And in hindsight, the Foo Fighters marked a turning point. The first time modern military aviation collided head-on with something it could neither shoot down nor understand, setting the stage for a new era of aerial mystery that would soon be given a new name, a name born not in wartime Europe, but in the open skies of a post-war world still trying to make sense of what it had unleashed. When the war finally ended and the world exhaled in relief, the strange lights that had haunted combat pilots did not vanish with the surrender of Axis powers, but instead followed humanity into peacetime, slipping seamlessly from classified military reports into the uneasy silence of a world now shadowed by atomic weapons and ideological rivalry. Because the Foo Fighters had planted a seed of doubt in the collective mind of modern aviation, a realization that the skies were not as empty or as understood as engineers and generals had once believed. And in the years immediately following 1945, reports of unexplained aerial objects multiplied rather than faded, appearing not over battlefields but over farms, highways, cities, and coastlines, seen by civilians and trained observers alike. And though these sightings lacked the urgency of wartime encounters, they carried the same core elements: glowing objects, impossible maneuvers, silent flight, and sudden disappearance, creating a continuity that bridged war and peace. And it was in the summer of 1947 that this continuity erupted into public obsession, when a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 strange objects flying in formation near Mount Rainier, moving with a speed and motion he famously described as like saucers skipping across water, a phrase that would ignite the modern UFO era almost overnight, because newspapers seized on the imagery, simplifying the description into the now legendary term, flying saucers. And though Arnold never claimed the objects were extraterrestrial, the public imagination leapt far ahead of the facts, connecting his sighting to wartime rumors, secret weapons, and the unresolved mystery of the Foo Fighters. And for those who had flown combat missions just years earlier, the resemblance was impossible to ignore, because the objects Arnold described behaved exactly like the lights that had paced bombers and fighters over Europe, and yet the context had changed dramatically as the United States government, now emerging as a global superpower, could not afford public panic or uncontrolled speculation, prompting the creation of official investigative efforts designed to explain, contain, or quietly neutralize the growing wave of sightings, efforts that would evolve through a series of programs: Project Sign, Project Grudge, and eventually Project Blue Book, each tasked with collecting reports, interviewing witnesses, and offering explanations that ranged from experimental aircraft to astronomical misidentifications. Yet despite thousands of cases and years of study, a stubborn residue of incidents resisted closure, mirroring the unresolved nature of the Foo Fighter reports that had preceded them. And adding to the tension was the Cold War itself, because in an era defined by espionage, surveillance, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Unidentified objects in restricted airspace were not merely curiosities, but potential catalysts for catastrophe. And so sightings near missile bases, nuclear facilities, and strategic air command assets carried a weight that far exceeded the simple question of what is that, forcing military planners to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. Something was capable of entering controlled airspace with impunity, something that outperformed known aircraft and left no trace. And whether that something was advanced foreign technology, misunderstood natural phenomena, or something far stranger was almost secondary to the fact that it existed at all. And as decades passed and technology advanced, the language changed. Flying saucers became UFOs, UFOs became UAPs. But the core mystery endured, and in retrospect, the Foo Fighters of World War II appear less like an isolated wartime anomaly and more like the opening chapter of a much longer story. The first modern wave of encounters between human flight and an unknown aerial presence, a story shaped by fear, secrecy, and limits of human understanding. Because long before radar networks blanketed the skies and satellites watched every corner of the Earth, young men in fragile aircraft stared into the darkness and saw something watching back. And though history often treats those sightings as footnotes or curiosities, they may represent the moment when humanity first realized that mastering the sky did not mean owning it, and that even in an age of steel, fire, and nuclear power, there remain questions that refuse to be conquered. For decades after the last Foo Fighter report faded into archived paperwork and half-forgotten anecdotes, the mystery lingered in a strange limbo, too unsettling to embrace, yet too persistent to fully dismiss, until time itself began to change the conversation. Because as generations passed and the immediate pressures of war and Cold War secrecy loosened their grip, governments slowly began re-examining what had once been locked away. And in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, declassified military files surfaced that cast the Foo Fighters in a new and far more serious light, revealing that these encounters were never treated as jokes or hallucinations by those tasked with protecting national airspace, but instead logged meticulously, cross-referenced, and quietly debated at the highest levels. And when historians and researchers reviewed these documents, they found something striking. The consistency, because regardless of year, country, or aircraft type, the reports echoed the same characteristics. Objects that appeared suddenly, maneuvered intelligently, ignored aerodynamic limits, evaded radar, and showed no hostile intent. Traits identical not only to wartime Foo Fighters, but to modern UAP encounters recorded by advanced sensor systems, suggesting not a series of unrelated mysteries, but a single enduring phenomenon observed through different technological lenses. And as this realization gained traction, military analysts began reframing the Foo Fighters not as relics of superstitious past, but as the earliest documented cases of what would now be classified as unidentified aerial phenomena. Encounters made all the more compelling by the fact that they were witnessed by trained combat pilots operating under extreme conditions where misinterpretation could mean death. And perhaps most unsettling of all was what the files did not contain: definitive explanations. Because even after decades of technological advancement, satellite, surveillance, and global radar coverage, modern militaries still encountered objects that mirrored Foo Fighter behavior with uncanny precision. Objects that accelerated instantly, hovered without propulsion, and vanished without sonic booms, raising the uncomfortable possibility that whatever haunted the skies of World War II had never left, but simply adapted to remain just beyond reach. And in this context, the Foo Fighters took on new significance. No longer just a wartime curiosity, but a warning from the past. An early signal that humanity's relationship with the sky included variables it did not control, and as governments began openly acknowledging the limits of their knowledge, releasing footage, confirming encounters, and admitting uncertainty, the tone of the discussion shifted dramatically, from ridicule to cautious inquiry, because when institutions built on control admit ignorance, it signals something fundamental. and historians now argue that the Foo Fighters represent. The moment modern aviation first encountered the unknown without the filter of myth or folklore, recorded instead through logs, instruments, and disciplined testimony. And yet for all the data and debate, the core question remains unchanged from that first winter over Europe. Intent, because whether the Foo Fighters and their modern counterparts are advanced technology, unknown natural phenomena, or something else entirely, their behavior suggests observation rather than aggression, presence, without interference, as if humanity's mastery of flight marked a threshold worth monitoring. And that idea, more than any single explanation, unsettles modern thinkers, because it implies that technological progress does not go unnoticed, and that the skies are not merely empty space, but a domain shared with forces we have yet to comprehend. And so the Foo Fighters endure not because they were solved, but because they were not, standing as a reminder that even in an age of satellites and supercomputers, the universe still withholds its answers, and that the men who first saw those lights from vibrating cockpits were not witnesses to a closed chapter of history, but to the opening lines of a mystery still unfolding. The older I get, the more I realize that history does not move in straight lines, but in echoes, repeating patterns that resurface when conditions are right. And it is impossible for me to think about that night in 2013, staring down from a civilian aircraft into a lightless void pierced by two stubborn glowing points, without hearing the voices of wartime pilots layered over my own thoughts. Because the distance between their vibrating cockpits and my pressurized cabin suddenly feels far, smaller than it should, as if time itself compressed the moment. And what unsettles me most is not the mystery of what those lights were, but the familiarity of the experience, because the same emotions described in World War II reports, confusion, rationalization, denial, and finally unease, unfolded in the same order inside my own mind. Despite decades of technological advancement, in a world that insists it has moved beyond superstition. And this is where the Foo Fighters refuse to remain a historical footnote, because when examined honestly, they do not belong solely to the past, nor do they sit comfortably within science fiction, instead occupying an uncomfortable middle ground where evidence exists without explanation. And as modern pilots, astronauts, and sensor operators continue to report encounters that mirror those wartime sightings with disturbing precision, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss the Foo Fighters as artifacts of stress or ignorance, because stress does not produce identical observations across continents and generations, and ignorance does not align radar, infrared, visual confirmation, and disciplined testimony into the same unresolved shape. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Foo Fighters. Not that they prove any single theory, but that they expose a blind spot in human certainty. A reminder that control is often an illusion maintained by familiarity rather than understanding. Because in World War II, the sky was a battlefield. Men believed they understood, mapped, measured, and mastered, until something appeared that obeyed none of their rules. And in a modern era, where satellites track storms and aircraft to the inch, the same assumption persists, only to be quietly undermined by encounters that still resist explanation, suggesting that the unknown did not retreat in the face of progress, but simply learned to remain just outside our frameworks. And when viewed this way, the Foo Fighters may represent the first moment humanity crossed an invisible threshold, when flight itself became a signal, an announcement that our species had entered a domain long observed but rarely challenged. And if that idea feels unsettling, it is because it reframes the mystery away from invasion or threat and towards something far subtler. Observation, patience, and restraint, qualities far more unnerving than open hostility. And this interpretation casts a long shadow over both past and present, because it implies that those wartime lights were not reacting to conflict, nor were the ones I saw reacting to me, but rather to something broader, something cumulative, as if each aircraft, each engine igniting against gravity, was another data point in a much longer watch. And yet for all the speculation, the most honest conclusion remains the simplest one. The same conclusion reached by exhausted pilots returning from night missions in 1944. We do not know, and that uncertainty, rather than diminishing the story, gives it weight, because mysteries that endure across generations do so not because they are poorly examined, but because they're deeply resistant to reduction. And so the Foo Fighters endure not as proof of any single answer, but as a question that refuses to age, a question written into the sky itself, waiting for each new generation to encounter it in their own way, whether through a gun sight over Europe, a radar scope over the Pacific, or a passenger window high above a sleeping continent. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all is this: if those lights were watching, then they still are. And if they were not, then the universe is capable of producing phenomena so strange, so consistent, and so elusive that even our best tools cannot pin them down. And either possibility should give us pause, because both suggest that the story of human flight, of mastery, dominance, and certainty is far from complete, and that the sky, vast and silent, has always been more than empty. Space between destinations, it has been a mirror reflecting back not just our machines, but the limits of our understanding. What lingers after the story ends is never the spectacle, never the glowing lights themselves, but the quiet space they leave behind, the mental silence where certainty used to live. Because once you accept that something can exist beyond explanation without immediately resolving into threat or fantasy, you're forced to reconsider how much of reality depends on naming things rather than understanding them. And this is where the Foo Fighters finally detach themselves from history books and enter something far more personal, because they are not just an aviation mystery or a wartime curiosity. They're a lesson in epistemology disguised as lights in the sky, a reminder that observation does not equal comprehension, and that even disciplined, repeated, well-documented encounters can still end with an honest admission of ignorance, something modern culture struggles to tolerate, preferring clean conclusions and definitive labels. Yet the Foo Fighters resist all such closure, and perhaps that resistance is the point, because when pilots in 1944 saw those lights, they did not gain new power or knowledge. They gained perspective, the unsettling awareness that mastery is conditional and that the sky they fought in was never truly theirs. And when civilians, scientists, and military operators encounter similar phenomena today, the same dynamic unfolds. Stripped of wartime urgency, but heavy with existential implication. Because if something can enter our most controlled domains without challenge, without explanation, and without hostility, then dominance is no longer the correct framework through which to view our relationship with the unknown. And this reframing quietly undermines one of humanity's oldest instincts: to assume that what we cannot explain must either be conquered or dismissed, because the Foo Fighters do neither. They do not attack, they do not communicate, and they do not vanish forever. They simply persist at the edge of perception, reappearing often enough to remain undeniable and disappearing often enough to remain unresolved. And in that persistence lies their true power, not as evidence of any specific theory, but as a stress test for human certainty, revealing how quickly confidence fractures when faced with phenomena that do not conform to our expectations. And this may explain why the Foo Fighters were quietly shelved after the war, why their files gathered dust while new terminology replaced old, because unresolved questions are uncomfortable, especially for institutions built on authority and control. Yet history has a way of resurfacing what it suppresses. And today, as governments cautiously acknowledge unidentified aerial phenomena and release fragments of data without conclusions, the shadow of the Foo Fighters looms large, not as a solved precursor, but as a warning that the unknown does not expire simply because we rename it. And perhaps the most honest position is the one shared by those wartime pilots and modern witnesses alike. Humility, the recognition that the universe does not owe us clarity on our timeline, and that observation without interpretation is not failure, but a form of respect for complexity. And so the question that remains is not, what were the Foo Fighters? Because that question may never yield a satisfying answer. but rather, what does it mean that they were seen at all? And in that question lies a quieter, deeper shift, because it suggests that progress does not eliminate mystery, it sharpens it, revealing not how much we know, but how much we are still learning how to ask. And as long as humans continue to look up, to fly, to probe the boundaries between earth and sky, that question will remain suspended above us, glowing faintly, patient and unresolved, waiting not to be solved, but to be encountered again. There is a subtle shift that happens once you truly accept uncertainty, not as a temporary gap in knowledge, but as a permanent companion of progress. And it changes the way you read history, the way you listen to testimony, and the way you look at the sky, because after the Foo Fighters, after flying saucers, after UAPs and declassified acknowledgments, certainty no longer feels like the default state of reality, but rather a fragile convenience we construct to function. And this realization carries consequences that stretch far beyond aviation or military files, because if the skies, once thought conquered, still hold phenomena that elude explanation, then the same may be true of every domain we assume mastery over, from the oceans we map to the technologies we trust. And in this sense, the Foo Fighters represent a quiet fracture in the modern worldview. The moment when industrial confidence met a boundary it could not cross. And what followed was not collapse, but compartmentalization. The decision to move forward without answers, to build faster aircraft, better sensors, and more sophisticated weapons while leaving certain questions unresolved, sealed behind classification stamps, or softened by euphemisms. And yet those questions never stopped exerting pressure, resurfacing whenever a new generation of pilots, radar operators, or astronauts encountered something that behaved not randomly, but deliberately, something that interacted without engaging, observed without intervening, and departed without explanation, forcing each witness to confront the same uncomfortable realization faced by their predecessors. The human advancement does not occur in isolation, and that reaching higher does not mean reaching alone. And perhaps the most profound legacy of the Foo Fighters is not the mystery itself, but the pattern of response it reveals, because again and again, institutions respond first with denial, then with minimization, and finally with quiet admission of uncertainty, a cycle that repeats not because of malice, but because ambiguity threatens authority, and authority depends on the appearance of control. Yet control has always been partial, conditional, and negotiated with forces far older and larger than human systems. And when framed this way, the Foo Fighters stop being an anomaly and become a reference point, a baseline encounter against which all later aerial mysteries are measured, reminding us that even at the dawn of modern flight, when humans first began to truly inhabit the sky, something was already there to meet them, and whether that presence was technological, natural, or something entirely outside existing categories may ultimately matter less than how consistently it has refused to define itself. Because definition invites response, and response invites escalation, while ambiguity preserves distance, and that restraint, shown repeatedly across decades, stands in stark contrast to human behavior, suggesting a form of intelligence or process fundamentally unlike our own. And this is where the question shifts again, away from origin and toward implication. Because if the unknown chooses not to interfere, not to reveal, and not to vanish, then perhaps the purpose is not contact but calibration, not invasion but observation. And if that idea feels unsettling, it is because it places humanity not at the center of the story, but as one subject within it, observed during moments of technological transition, from propellers to jets, from radar to satellites, from war to global surveillance. And as we now stand on the edge of autonomous flight, artificial intelligence, and permanent presence in space, the pattern invites an uncomfortable thought that the Foo Fighters were never tied to a specific era, but to thresholds appearing when our relationship with the sky fundamentally changes. And if that is true, then their absence would be more alarming than their presence, because silence would suggest disengagement, and engagement, however distant, implies relevance. And so the true weight of the Foo Fighters lies not in what they were, but in what they may still represent, a quiet reminder that progress is noticed, that boundaries are monitored, and that the universe is not obligated to announce itself on human terms. And as we continue forward, building higher, faster, and farther, the question is no longer whether we will encounter the unknown again, but whether we will recognize it when we do, or whether, like before, it will simply glow briefly at the edge of perception, patient, unresolved, and waiting for us to catch up. Thresholds are peculiar things. They are not simply lines on a map or points on a timeline. They are moments where the rules bend, where what was impossible becomes plausible, and where observation itself begins to change the observed. The Foo Fighters, the UAPs, the flickers on radar screens. They were thresholds, markers of technological and cognitive transitions. Every era of aviation brought with it a new set of assumptions. Propeller-driven aircraft defined the limits of speed and maneuverability, and humans learned to predict weather, trajectories, and enemy movements accordingly. Then came jets, faster and higher, rewriting expectations in months what had taken decades. Radar systems promised a panoptic certainty, machines that could detect everything. But even they had blind spots, gaps the Foo Fighters slipped through, laughing silently at human hubris. Thresholds are not accidental. They're the moments where perception meets capability. When humans invented radar, they did not expect to see everything. When they launched jets, they did not expect every object in the sky to conform. When satellites circled the planet, they did not imagine the gaze returning in forms that defied categorization. And yet every time, something did, appearing precisely at the edge of detection, just beyond interference, perfectly calibrated to test limits without confrontation. What makes thresholds so unnerving is their implication. That progress is observed, not alone. For decades, pilots described movements impossible by current aeronautical understanding. Right-angle turns, instant accelerations, hovering in defiance of gravity. Engineers shook their heads, traced calculations, redrew models, but the objects kept appearing. They were markers, reminders that advancement is not unilateral. Something else was learning, adapting, or simply existing in parallel, measuring humans' thresholds as precisely as humans measured theirs. History, then, is punctuated by thresholds. The first radar contact, the first jet crossing, the first satellite image of Earth. At each juncture, the unknown appeared, unannounced, a silent metric of human ambition. And as technology continues to advance, autonomous drones, AI-driven surveillance, space stations in geostationary orbit, the threshold moves with it, always a step ahead, always at the boundary of comprehension. The unsettling lesson is not just that there is something we do not understand. It is that the universe, or whatever inhabits it, does not operate by our timelines or priorities. It marks thresholds on its own terms. Humans leap, and it waits. Humans probe, and it observes. Contact is not confrontation. Presence is not aggression. Thresholds are teaching moments, not battles, and every generation confronts them anew. And so, the Foo Fighters were never anomalies to be cataloged. They were reminders. Every new capability brings a corresponding observation. Every advance is met with measurement. Every threshold crossed is a threshold noted, a quiet assertion that human mastery is provisional. The sky is not conquered, it is negotiated, and humanity stands at each new threshold with a choice: to ignore, to record, or to wonder. Because thresholds do not vanish. They endure. And when we step across them, we are not entering the future alone. Something has already arrived, waiting.